June 6, 1944. 150,000 men are about to storm the beaches of Normandy. If the weather had been just slightly worse, if one German general had stayed at his desk instead of visiting his wife, if Hitler had woken up 6 hours earlier, every single one of them would have died on those beaches. And the world you're living in right now wouldn't exist. Let me show you exactly how close we came to complete disaster. D-Day is sold to us as this inevitable Allied victory. The good guys land on the beaches, they push through, they liberate France, game over. But that's not what actually happened. D-Day was a desperate gamble that barely worked. Eisenhower wrote a letter the night before accepting full responsibility for the failure because he genuinely believed it might not succeed. The weather was terrible. The Germans were dug in with machine guns and artillery pointed directly at the landing zones. Thousands of men died in the first 30 minutes. This operation was hanging by a thread. So today, we're diving into the nightmare scenario. What if that thread had snapped? What if D-Day had failed? Because I'm telling you right now, it almost did. Before we get into the alternate timeline, you need to understand just how insane the actual D-Day invasion was. This wasn't some carefully controlled military operation where everything went according to plan. This was chaos from the very beginning. Let's start with the weather. Eisenhower had a tiny window to launch this invasion. The tides had to be right. The moon had to be right for the paratroopers. And the weather had to cooperate. In early June 1944, the weather over the English Channel was absolutely terrible. Storms, high waves, low visibility. Eisenhower's meteorologist told him there might be a brief break in the weather on June 6th. Might. Not well. Might. And based on that slim possibility, Eisenhower made the call to go. If he'd waited, the next good window wouldn't come for another 2 weeks, and by then, the Germans might have discovered the entire plan. So on the night of June 5th, thousands of ships loaded with soldiers started crossing the channel in rough seas. Men were getting seasick before they even reached France. Landing craft were swamped by waves. Some sank, and this was before a single shot was fired. Now let's talk about the paratroopers. The plan was to drop thousands of American and British paratroopers behind enemy lines to secure key bridges and roads. Sounds good on paper. In reality, the planes carrying these paratroopers ran into heavy cloud cover and German anti-aircraft fire. Pilots panicked and dropped their troops all over the place. Some paratroopers landed miles from their targets. Some landed in flooded fields and drowned because their equipment was too heavy. Some landed right in the middle of German positions and were killed immediately. The 82nd and 101st Airborne were scattered across Normandy like confetti. Most of them spent the first 12 hours just trying to figure out where they were and find their units. Then you've got the beach landings themselves. 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Some went okay. Others were absolute nightmares. Omaha Beach was the worst. The Germans had the high ground. They had concrete bunkers with machine guns. They had artillery. They had a clear line of sight down the entire beach. When the first wave of American soldiers hit Omaha, they were cut to pieces. The ramps dropped on the landing craft and men just started dying. Machine gun fire ripped through them before they even touched the sand. Mortar rounds exploded in the surf. Bodies piled up at the waterline. For the first 2 hours, the invasion at Omaha Beach was failing. Soldiers were pinned down behind whatever cover they could find. Officers were dead. Radios weren't working. Landing craft were burning. The entire beach was a killing zone. Some units took 90% casualties in the first 15 minutes. Commanders on the ships offshore were seriously considering calling off the landing and evacuating whoever was left. That's how bad it was. But here's the thing that saved D-Day. A few things, actually. First, the German high command was completely confused about where the real invasion was happening. They thought Normandy might be a diversion and the real attack would come at Calais. So they held back their panzer divisions. Second, Field Marshal Rommel, who was in charge of defending the Atlantic Wall, wasn't even there. He'd gone back to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. If he'd been at his headquarters, the German response would have been much faster and much more coordinated. Third, Hitler was asleep, and nobody wanted to wake him up to ask permission to move the panzer reserves. By the time he woke up and gave the order, it was too late. The Allies had established a foothold. But let's be clear, this was luck. Pure, dumb luck mixed with incredible courage from the soldiers on the ground. If any one of these factors had gone differently, D-Day fails. The weather gets worse and landing craft can't make it across. Rommel stays at his post and coordinates an immediate counterattack. Hitler wakes up early and releases the panzers in time to hit the beaches. The German high command figures out Normandy is the real target and sends reinforcements immediately. Any of these scenarios, and the invasion collapses. So what happens if it does? What does that timeline look like? That's what we're about to explore. And I'm warning you now, it gets dark. Let's say the invasion fails. The weather on June 6th is slightly worse than it actually was. More landing craft get swamped and sink before reaching the beaches. The ones that do make it are even more disorganized. The paratroopers are even more scattered. And Rommel, let's say he decides not to visit his wife and stays at his headquarters instead. He sees the invasion happening and immediately orders German reinforcements to the beaches. The panzer divisions start moving within the first hour instead of waiting all day for Hitler's permission. Now you've got German tanks rolling toward the landing zones while Allied troops are still trying to get off the beaches. Omaha Beach, which was already a slaughter in our timeline, becomes completely untenable. The Germans push the Americans back into the sea. Thousands are killed. Thousands more are captured. The beach is littered with destroyed landing craft and bodies. By the end of June 6th, it's clear the invasion has failed. Eisenhower orders a retreat. The ships that can still sail start evacuating whoever's left. It's the worst military disaster in American and British history. The numbers are staggering. In our timeline, the Allies took about 10,000 casualties on D-Day. In this timeline, they're looking at 50,000 or more. Entire divisions are wiped out. The political fallout is immediate and catastrophic. In Britain, Churchill is done. The British people have been at war for 5 years. They've endured the Blitz. They've sent their sons and husbands to fight in North Africa, Italy, and now France. And for what? To watch them die on a beach in Normandy while the government promised victory. Churchill loses a vote of no confidence within weeks. A new government comes in and immediately starts talking about a negotiated peace with Germany. Britain is exhausted. They're running out of money, out of resources, out of men. Without a successful second front in Europe, there's no path to victory. Just endless grinding war. In America, the reaction is even worse. It's summer 1944. Roosevelt is running for an unprecedented fourth term. The D-Day failure becomes the central issue of the election. His opponents hammer him relentlessly. They ask why American boys were sent to die in a poorly planned invasion. They question the entire strategy of fighting in Europe when Japan is the country that actually attacked us at Pearl Harbor. Isolationist voices that had been quiet since 1941 suddenly get loud again. Roosevelt might still win the election because he's Roosevelt, but it's close. And even if he wins, he's politically weakened. The American public wants answers. They want accountability. And they're starting to question whether this war is worth it. Now let's talk about Stalin. The Soviet Union has been begging the Western Allies to open a second front for years. The Soviets are doing the vast majority of the fighting against Germany. They're taking millions of casualties. Cities are being destroyed. The Eastern Front is a meat grinder. And the whole time, Stalin is asking Churchill and Roosevelt, when are you going to invade France? When are you going to take pressure off us? Finally, in June 1944, it happens. D-Day. And then it fails. From Stalin's perspective, the Western Allies just prove they're either incompetent or they don't actually want to help. Maybe both. His paranoia, which is already off the charts, goes into overdrive. He starts wondering if the West wants Germany and the Soviet Union to destroy each other. He begins to seriously consider a separate peace with Germany, not because he likes Hitler, but because he's running out of options. The Soviet Union is bleeding out. Meanwhile, in Germany, the mood completely shifts. Before D-Day, there was this creeping sense that the war was lost. The Allies were advancing in Italy. The Soviets were pushing from the east. German cities were being bombed around the clock. Morale was low. But then the Allies try to invade France and get thrown back into the sea. Suddenly, Goebbels has the propaganda victory of a lifetime. Fortress Europe holds. The Atlantic Wall is impregnable. The Reich will last 1,000 years. All that propaganda that sounded hollow before now has teeth. German morale skyrockets. Soldiers who were questioning the war now believe they can actually win. Hitler, of course, takes full credit. He's the genius who fortified the coast. He's the leader who saw through the Allied deception. His grip on power, which had been slipping as the war turned against Germany, tightens again. The military officers who were planning to assassinate him in July 1944, the Valkyrie plot, they lose their nerve. Why kill Hitler when he just won the greatest defensive victory of the war? The plot either doesn't happen or it fails even harder than it did in our timeline. And now Germany has breathing room. All those divisions that were tied up defending France, waiting for an invasion, they can be moved. Some go east to reinforce the fight against the Soviets. Others stay in the west, but focus on building even stronger fortifications. The V-2 rocket attacks on London continue and intensify. Britain is getting hit every single day with missiles they can't stop. The psychological impact is devastating. In France, the resistance movements that had been preparing to rise up and help the Allies during the invasion are now completely exposed. The Germans know who many of them are. There's a massive crackdown. Thousands of French resistance fighters are rounded up and executed. Entire villages suspected of harboring resistance are wiped out. The brutal occupation that France had been enduring since 1940 gets even worse. And there's no hope of liberation anymore. The Allies tried and failed. France is going to be under Nazi control for the foreseeable future. Let's jump to 1945. In our timeline, by May 1945, Germany has surrendered. Hitler is dead. The war in Europe is over. In this alternate timeline, the war is still going. The Allies tried another invasion in late 1944 or early 1945, maybe. But with the Atlantic Wall reinforced and German morale high, it either failed again or they didn't even attempt it. The strategic bombing campaign continues, but it's not enough to force a surrender. Germany is battered but still fighting. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets are still pushing, but it's much slower without the Second Front to divide German forces. The Battle of Kursk still probably happens, and the Soviets probably still win because their industrial capacity is massive. But the follow-up offensives are less successful. The Germans have more troops available. They're fighting a 1.5 front war instead of a true 2-front war. The Eastern Front stabilizes somewhere in Poland or Eastern Germany. It's a bloody stalemate. By mid-1945, everyone is exhausted. The Soviets have lost tens of millions of people. The Germans are running out of everything except willpower. The Western Allies are stuck in Italy and don't have a way into France. And then the atomic bomb enters the equation. In August 1945, the Manhattan Project succeeds just like in our timeline. America has the bomb. But who do they use it on? In our timeline, the choice was clear. Japan dropped the bombs, end the war in the Pacific. But in this timeline, Japan might have already negotiated a peace after their naval losses, or the war in the Pacific is still grinding on. Either way, the question becomes, do we use the atomic bomb on Germany? Truman is under enormous pressure to end the war in Europe. But bombing a European city with a nuclear weapon is a different political calculation than bombing Japan. Germany is white. They're Christian. Many Americans have German ancestry. There's going to be significant moral and political resistance to nuking Berlin or Hamburg. But let's say they do it anyway. America drops an atomic bomb on a German city. Maybe two. The destruction is total. Hundreds of thousands dead instantly. The world is horrified. Germany doesn't surrender immediately because the Nazi leadership is insane and fanatical. But the writing is on the wall. They can't win against an enemy with that kind of weapon. Negotiations start. Not unconditional surrender like in our timeline, but a negotiated settlement. Germany withdraws from France and the Low Countries. They keep Austria and parts of Poland. The Nazi regime stays in power but agrees to stop the war. The alternative is even darker. Germany is working on their own atomic program. It's behind schedule and probably wouldn't succeed, but in this timeline, with the extra year or two, maybe it does. Germany gets the bomb in late 1945 or 1946. Now you've got a nuclear standoff. America has nukes. Germany has nukes. The Soviets are racing to develop their own. The war doesn't end with a clear victory. It ends with an uneasy peace based on mutual assured destruction. Here's the moment that defines this entire alternate timeline. It's the summer of 1946. The war has been going for 7 years. Everyone is exhausted. Germany controls most of Europe from France to Poland. The Soviet Union is bled white and stuck behind their borders. Britain is barely holding on. America is tired of sending resources and soldiers to a war that seems unwinnable. And then the peace conference happens. Representatives from all the major powers sit down to negotiate. It's not Yalta or Potsdam, where the Allies dictate terms to a defeated Germany. It's a real negotiation between powers that fought to a standstill. Germany agrees to give up some territory, but keeps most of their gains. The Nazi regime stays in power. The Holocaust, which had been running for years, is essentially ignored in the negotiations because nobody has the leverage to demand trials or justice. Millions of people who were murdered in camps will never see justice. The perpetrators walk free. The world that emerges from this peace is fundamentally broken. There's no United Nations based on the principle that aggression must be punished. There's no NATO. There's no European Union. There's no sense that the good guys won, and now we can build a better world. Instead, it's just exhaustion and compromise. Evil wasn't defeated. It was negotiated with. And that changes everything about how the next 50 years unfold. So that's what happens if D-Day fails. The invasion collapses on the beaches. Tens of thousands die. Churchill falls. Roosevelt is weakened. Stalin considers a separate peace. Germany's morale surges. The war drags on for another year or two. And it ends not with clear Allied victory, but with a negotiated settlement that leaves the Nazi regime in power and millions of victims without justice. The world we know doesn't exist in this timeline. There's no post-war economic boom, no Marshall Plan, no liberation of concentration camps by Allied forces. The political and moral structure of the modern world, the idea that democracy and human rights matter, that's all weakened or gone. Instead, you've got a cynical world order where fascism survived because it fought hard enough and the democracies got tired. D-Day wasn't inevitable. It was a gamble. And the men who landed on those beaches, who pushed forward under machine gun fire, who refused to give up even when it looked hopeless, they're the reason we're not living in that darker timeline. The invasion succeeded by the thinnest possible margin. A few different decisions, a bit worse weather, one general in the right place at the right time, and everything changes. That's how fragile history really is. And that's how much we owe to the soldiers who made it work. Hit subscribe if you want to see what else almost went wrong.